Continuing this module on governing water as common property. If you remember, in the last section, we looked at the whole idea of what and how do we define common property water resources. These resources, we said, were the resources that the community owns and is managed in different ways by the community, or sometimes it is managed by the government. We also said that the most important use is going to be the use of these resources in irrigation. Now, why is irrigation such an important use? If you see, the question of irrigation is essential because it involves a large number of actors coming together and taking action at the same time. So irrigation requires both coordination and cooperation, and historically this has been something that has been true for ancient civilizations till date. Now if you see, there are two elements to it. One is the building of the infrastructure in order to move water around. So this infrastructure needs to also be maintained in order to have efficient and effective irrigation, right? So this is considered the provisioning problem, the fact that you have to maintain your irrigation systems, whether this be a large canal or a small tank. Remember, you need canals, channels which take water from the surface water resources and lead it up to the field. The second part, which becomes even more difficult in some ways, is then how do we share the water once you construct these structures. So this water is shared, right? That farmers, so for instance, what is a very commonly seen problem? Some farmers, the head-end farmers, have their plots of land near the canal directly, while other farmers have it further away. Now water, when it flows via the channel, some of it will be taken by these head-end farmers, but some of it has to be kept behind to allow it to flow for the tail-end farmers. How is this distribution managed? So you see, it is inevitably a question of who gets this water, right? So the question of irrigation is also a question of distribution among different sections of interested stakeholders in the area. And in agriculture, we have two main sets: one, your landless; the second, the landholding sections. If you see, and the NSS report in fact does find, looking at the use of irrigation, finds that for the use of these common property resources by different categories of households. You can see this in the table. So what this table shows is that this table gives the percentage of households that report use of water resources that are not owned by them. Right? Here we are going by a de facto definition where we are taking common property water resources as all those resources that these households do not individually own. And then we see these common resources which they do not own, how much proportion of it do different categories of households use, both for the purpose of irrigation and the purpose of livestock rearing. First, what you see from the table is that both in the case of irrigation and livestock rearing, the percentages of rural labor households using such water resources are much smaller than the category of the other households, that is the landowning households. Now, why would this make, what does this indicate? Obviously, that the landless, one reason, because they don't have access to land, so they don't get a share of that irrigation water, surface water directly, so they get a much smaller proportion. Interestingly, and contradictory to expectations in some way, this is true even in the case for livestock rearing. And among landholding households, it is in fact what we find, with an increase in land size, the dependence on this actually decreases for houses holding land sizes of above 0.2 hectare. While even if you look at it among landholding households, as the landholding size increases, you see that the percentage of use for irrigation decreases. Contrarily, on the other hand, you find that actually as this increase occurs for livestock rearing, the larger land households still use more common property water as well. Now this is a question there, right? That what you see now is that even households, one would expect that these larger landholders possess their individual water sources, even they still depend on the common resources for the purpose of irrigation, for the purpose of livestock rearing. Now, what do we understand from this? What we are basically saying therefore is that look, both irrigation and livestock rearing, particularly irrigation, remains an important the common property resources remain an important factor for water use across household categories. In fact, if we look at it historically, there is a shift on the extent of dependence on these resources. If you see the evolution of irrigation policy in India, you see in the beginning that the first period post-independence has public investment, which is the main force. So from the 1950s till the 1970s, there is a rapid increase in the area under large public irrigation schemes. Why? Because one, there was this urgency of a food crisis. There was this feeling that look, we need this green revolution in order to increase our food production, for which making irrigation available was considered an essential first step. So the government intervened. It invested both in a set of agricultural activities, research, and invested in the building of irrigation facilities. So these were, if you would consider, part of our common systems. Now, if you see, post your late 1970s, there is a shift where private investments take over. So there is a rapid increase in the area under groundwater irrigation. Now in this period, what happens is that you increasingly find that your public irrigation systems tend to be underutilized and serve only a fraction of the designed command. Your small surface structures, notably tanks in southern India, your kuls and similar systems in Himachal Pradesh, your alpine systems in southern Bihar, have been losing area since your 1950s itself. But post 1990s, even the large irrigation systems begin shrinking. So you see, if you look at the graph, you can see this whole shift which is happening where your groundwater irrigated area grows massively, your canal irrigated area remains more or less constant, your tank irrigation area is very low, right? So, and in fact, you can look up this source. This is by Aditi Mukherjee from EPW. Now, if you see further, what is the reason for this decline in? What is the reason for this shift to groundwater? What you have is one, that you have with the green revolution and this entire focus on production of food, we have huge amount of cropping intensity increases. And what you find is that our public systems did not serve to fulfill all these needs. On the other hand, and simultaneously, you have technological innovations in both cheap pumps and pumping equipment that make your groundwater much easier to access, much more affordable, and therefore much more spread out. Groundwater also gives you certain advantages. One, it is very reliable. Like for instance, if you talk to a farmer and you ask them, why do you use groundwater? Isn't there a tank nearby? They say very clearly, look, I wake up in the morning, I press a switch, water goes to my field. Now for a tank water, there is so much more effort involved in both maintenance and in distribution. And the farmer is always uncertain about getting that water to his or her household. Simultaneously, you had a decrease of public investment in your large systems, and you also had a problem that your bureaucracy was becoming, there were conflicts between different departments, and there was a way in which promotion of this private investment in groundwater was being supported by the state at the same time. So you have finally a whole system whereby there is an increase in use of groundwater and a decrease in dependence on other sources. Now, what inevitably happened? Groundwater also has a recharge period. We of course know that it is a renewable resource. But despite being a renewable resource, there is a rate at which groundwater renewability even occurs. But what we find is that since the early 2000s, what we find is that there has been an increasing dependence on groundwater. So much so that in the last recent period, from about the early 2000s, you find that there is finally a slowing down. It's not a shift, but at least a slowing down of the growth rate, where your groundwater irrigated area grows at 2.5% per annum in this last period, as compared to a long-term average growth of 3.58% per annum from 1950 to 2009. Now, this groundwater boom seems to have reduced. But what has happened is that a large proportion of our agriculture still depends on it. If you see, 9 major states in India are in critical groundwater condition, where pumping exceeds the long-term recharge of our aquifers. So there has been correspondingly a re-emergence of interest in how do we sustain, how do we bring back our surface water systems, whether they be the large canals or whether they be all our tanks and the earlier water harvesting systems, and the way in which participatory irrigation management can play an important role in this. In order to do so, if you see, this needs a further study on the question of the use of groundwater, which is what we will be taking up in the next section. So, giving a brief recap of this section, we have seen that across households, landholding households use a larger proportion of water both for irrigation and livestock rearing. You find that as land size increases, water usage for irrigation increases, while water usage for livestock rearing. In conclusion, let us have a quick recap of this section. First, we looked at the whole question of the common property water resource use in the villages, and the NSS 54th round gave us material which showed that this in fact varies across households depending on the categories, that the landless don't use much, while among landholding categories, irrigation water usage decreases as landholding size increases, while for livestock rearing the opposite trend occurs. We continued with the study of the evolution of the irrigation systems historically in India post-independence, and the shift from the use of our government managed systems, the canal systems, to much and more prioritization of groundwater systems. And in the next section, we will continue this by looking in more depth at this whole idea, the usage of groundwater and the notion of groundwater as a commons. Thank you.